and welcome to all of you in the audience, and obviously our distinguished panelists for this session on economic possibilities for the new, or perhaps it feels not so new government. But anyway, it's a session where I really hope we can explore a lot of the challenges, the undoubted challenges that policymakers in Britain will be facing over the next 5 years and more. A couple of introductory things. Well, first I should say who I am. I'm Tony Venables from the Economics Department, chairing this. But let me also start off by saying a word or two about the Sanjay Lal Memorial Trust that is funding this, organising this event, and that brings in a distinguished visiting professor every year. It's been enormously successful in doing this. I mean, I should say Sanjay Lal was a professor here who did a lot of work in development economics and trade and thinking about multinational activity, foreign direct investment, technical change in developing countries. So the trust was set up in his memory, and it's been enormously successful, largely due to the driving force of Rani Lal, who's sitting there right at the front in bringing people in. So Paul was the distinguished visiting professor last year, but it's great to have Paul Krugman back again this year as a distinguished fellow, I think his title is this year. The visiting professor this year, who I think arrives next week, is Abhijit Banerjee, development economist from MIT, who also will be doing some panels and some public events. Okay. The theme for today, obviously, understanding these challenges for the British economy over coming years. Let me briefly introduce the panel and then get down to business. Paul Krugman, one inevitably has to say, needs, deserves, whatever, no introduction. You all know his academic track record, Nobel laureate in economics, absolutely prolific author of academic papers, books, columns, blogs, tweets, and the numbers of followers go to millions that I looked up last year, but I haven't even looked at anyway. Probably many more millions. So it's great to have Paul back here again. Martin Wolf is again, as you all know, the chief economic commentator, I believe that's his title, for the FT. And of course, I imagine just about everyone in this room reads Martin on a regular basis. So he's a prolific author too of columns, but also of books, not always with the snappiest title. You can see I've put my glasses on at this point. The last one, Shifts and Shocks, What We've Learned and Still Have to Learn from the Financial Crisis. So obviously someone who's really been following events, writing about events very, very closely over recent years. And the third panelist is David Hendry, Sir David, I should say, Professor of Economics here in the department. Very distinguished econometrician who's made big methodological advances, technical advances, but also really worked at applying those principally to the macroeconomy, but also to topics like climate change, really bringing rigorous statistical econometric techniques to bear on those issues. So a very distinguished panel, very good topic. The panel, I will endeavour to be a strict chair and certainly make space for 20 minutes or so of Q&A at the end. So there will be an opportunity for people to ask. So hold your questions till then, and let me ask Paul to kick off.
Okay. Well, thank you. And in some respects, I'm going to have some generic remarks about economic policy because there's a lot of things I don't know about Britain. I have focused a lot on these issues of austerity and fiscal policy and so on, but there's a lot more. But of all of which is stuff of which I know nothing, and the other panelists I think will weigh in on some of the other issues. So I guess that one has to start by saying, well, there was an election here. I am aware of that. And it was extremely gratifying. The result was extremely encouraging, not, of course, for policy, but intellectually. I'm a devoted reader of quantitative political science. And the U.S. elections are simpler because we really do have a two-party system, and it's been a lot clearer, and it's been stable for a long time. So we actually have a lot of empirical evidence on what is at least a somewhat stable structure. And the overwhelming result from U.S. political science literature is that elections are very strongly determined by economic conditions, but not as you might imagine. It's not, is the economy in good shape or is it in bad shape? It's certainly not the track record of an administration over its 4 years in power. It's all about the rate of change in the last 6 months before the election. The economy is growing reasonably well in the 6 months leading up to the election, then the incumbent party is generally returned to power. And that's a quite remarkable result. It suggests, there is a large literature on the political business cycle, suggesting that the short-sightedness of voters may create some perverse incentives. But if you actually believe this, which really descends from the Hibbs model, but anyway, if you believe that really it's the rate of growth in the last 6 months, it suggests that a government that pursues purely destructive, destabilizing policies, that simply for no reason whatsoever throws the economy into a slump so that it can have a relatively rapid recovery in the last 2 quarters before the election, is going to benefit politically. And so now we have confirmation of exactly that from the UK experience. Quite a remarkable achievement, actually. Now, to be fair, that's not exactly what happened. What you actually had was a government that imposed gratuitous austerity and then did not reverse it, but simply paused, stopped imposing austerity, and so the economy resumed growth, and it was good enough, combined with some other things that are beyond the topic of today's talk. So anyway, so intellectually gratifying. The largest challenge facing the British economy these next 5 years is probably what appears to be the fact that the government believes its own propaganda, believes its own legend, believes that its political success validates the policies it has pursued, that the recovery is in fact a reward for austerity, that the focus on debt as the public sector debt as the be-all and end-all of policy concerns was correct, which means that they're likely to, they've basically been given a chance to make the same mistakes again and are likely to seize it. And that has to be an important part of how you want to think about what lies ahead. Now, this would be all beside the point if we thought that the kinds of economic troubles that we've been experiencing for really a remarkably long time now, we're now in year 7, that this persistent shortfall of demand is about to be over, that we're going to be emerging, or we have emerged, that we can put all of those concerns about persistent slump and consistent tendency to slide back, particularly if you pursue ill-advised contractionary policies, that all of that is not going to be the issue, and we're going to return to an environment something like what prevailed in the 25 years before, when the problem of demand was managed quite effectively by technocrats at the central bank. So if we thought that this whole thing is over, then my concern there would be certainly a lot less relevant. Unfortunately, I don't think that is a safe conclusion to reach. It could be, of course, but if you follow these things, you should know that we've had many proclamations that the storm has passed. And each time, those tend partly to be self-refuting proclamations. When people believe that the storm has passed, they start to do things that put us right back into it. And there's a lot of reason to think that we are by no means out of these woods. So if this works as I think it will. So we've been talking a lot lately about I guess now we have a word which is the Bundschock. We have interest rates in a number of places, but most notably Germany, where they were heading for negative territory, which one of those things we didn't think was possible, but turns out to be, have abruptly jumped up. And so there are reasons for this. There may be some odd market dynamics going on, but certainly things are looking a bit better in Europe. So if we look at the European scene, There has been some positive growth. The threat of outright deflation seems to have receded. It looks as if some combination of factors, the depreciation of the euro, possibly some recovery of business confidence, and actually shades of the British experience, the fact that the Eurozone, after years of imposing ever harsher austerity, has essentially paused in its austerity drive. All of that contributes to some pickup in European outlook. So we say, oh, German rates are up. That's signaling all clear. Don't worry about a persistently depressed economy. But you need some perspective there. If you didn't know what interest rates were a few months ago, you would say, oh my God, look how low those interest rates are. That's the markets, in effect, voting that the European economy is facing many, many years of terrible growth performance, substantial risk of deflation. And I think that is still what the markets are, in effect, saying. They could be wrong, but it's still an era of incredible weakness. Now, you might want to say, well, okay, why am I talking about Europe? And the answer is, I have actually been putting in a fair bit of work on this now. We really cannot think of any economy, any advanced economy, as being an island here, even if you actually are an island. That was an inappropriate metaphor, I just realized. We are on an island, but now you have the Channel Tunnel, so I guess it's not really. Anyway, to what extent are the macroeconomic fortunes of different advanced countries really linked to each other? So I have often, it's a pretty good proposition, that short term, a year or two, not as much as people think. People tend to, the world is not flat. Even the UK, most of what you produce is actually non-tradable. The extent of direct physical or direct trade flow links with the European continent is not that large. So that if there is a year of particularly bad stuff in Europe, a period when the Eurozone economy has plunged back into recession, it's quite possible for the UK to continue to grow through that, or conversely, there's something happening here, it's not communicated. But really persistent shortfalls of demand do tend to get transmitted more or less fully internationally. And the reason is, if the markets think that the European economy is going to be weak for a very, very long time, that's going to translate into a weaker euro. And it's going to have to be a weak enough euro so that interest rates get more or less equalized across advanced countries. And I'm not sure if I'm making this argument quite as clearly as I'd like to, but there's a good reason, I think, to believe that if we are really talking about persistent weaknesses in any part of the world, they are likely to be shared very broadly across the world. So that if we're talking about, as I think we still are, a really troubled European economy, an economy, basically, the euro area looks a lot like Japan at the beginning. Japan early in its long stagnation. Many of the same things. Weak economy, demography very unfavorable for not just for the question of how do you pay for pensions, but also demography is unfavorable because if you have a shrinking working age population, it's hard to get people to invest, and the euro area does have a shrinking working age population. The line some people use is that Europe is starting to look like Japan without the social cohesion. So it is kind of an ugly scene, and here in Britain you cannot expect to insulate yourself from that, and actually even the United States cannot. One of the things, the US economic data have been strange, probably distorted by a really ugly winter, but also probably by some problems with seasonal adjustment, annoying stuff. But still, it does look as if the US economy is importing more weakness from the rest of the world, from Europe in particular, than apparently the Fed was ready for. So Britain, just by dint of the fact that it is an integrated world economy with capital flows and exchange rates and all of that, probably is faced with the continuation of the problem of persistent demand weakness, simply on account of what's happening outside Britain, which means you're still in that universe. Then UK's intrinsic weakness. So lots of people have pointed at this. This was the I know we can extend this another couple of quarters, but you know the point. The UK, okay, what do we think happened to the world? And at least one of the simple stories that is good enough to be a sort of baseline, I think, is that throughout the advanced world we had this run-up of household debt, that we had a big increase in household debt because people hadn't seen a crisis for a long time. Banking got careless. Big run-up in private sector, not public sector debt. Private sector debt, and whereas the Japanese version of it was largely corporate, and in the West it was basically households. And that we at a certain point we had a Minsky moment, or I still like the Wile E. Coyote moment. Laws of cartoon physics, you run off a cliff, and it's only when you look down that you fall. So there came a point when people said, oh, that's too much debt, I better pay off my debt. And everyone tried to do it at the same time. And of course, since my spending is your income and your spending is my income, the result is a depressed economy overall. What you have to do in the aftermath of that is you have to find some way that people can manage to reduce that debt burden down to a level where people are comfortable again. And by and large, that has not happened. It's happened to some in the US. It's happened hardly at all in the UK. And as we were just talking about before coming out here, the economic forecasts for the UK envision household debt rising ever higher in the years ahead. They rely on presumptions of strong consumer spending that would only be possible with ever rising household debt. That's at some point, right? At some point, Stein's law applies. I'm not sure what our mix of people here is, but that's Herbert Stein, a U.S. economist from some decades past, who had a number of laws, sort of the economics versions of Parkinson's laws. But what everybody refers to as Stein's law now is if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. And so Stein's law will come to bear. And so I think the UK, aside from the imported problem of demand weakness, the UK has its own inherent domestic problem of a household debt that is a very high level, and housing prices that are really very high compared with income, which goes along with that, and likely to see more problems. So now, am I forecasting another 2008 level crisis? Probably not, although one almost never does manage to get those things in advance. If you try to find people who did forecast the 2008 crisis, you find that they also forecast 10 or 15 other crises that didn't happen. So it's kind of a hard thing to get right. But trouble, the idea that you're likely to have a troubled economy suffering from persistent shortfalls of demand, I think is still quite likely. Now, we've had a really interesting discussion, actually a lot of what I was talking about when I was here last year, and still I think very live, which is whether this is something that is really very deeply seated, whether we have a problem. Certainly, most likely candidate is Western Europe, but also is the Euro area, but possibly the United States and the advanced world as a whole. Whether we basically have a situation where, quite aside from these debt issues, persistent shortfalls of demand are becoming the norm. This is the secular stagnation discussion, and has we've had some. It's an interesting idea. Potentially, I think I take it very seriously without being entirely convinced myself that it's true. It's not a crazy person's idea. You have Larry Summers now being the prime advocate of this view, and that if that's the case, then you really, really don't want to come into this era of at least a strong tendency towards secular stagnation. For the non-economists here, the word is the term is almost totally misleading. First of all, secular has nothing to do with the usual meaning. God doesn't enter into it one way or the other. And stagnation is not really the point. The point is an economy where you frequently find yourself in situations where zero interest rates are not enough to restore full employment. And if that's true, then governments that are obsessed with fiscal rectitude are going to be an even bigger problem, because in situations like that, you really are going to need fiscal policy to help you get out. You probably want to reconsider your inflation targets and so on. But again, drawing the wrong lessons from recent events could be a really bad problem in the years ahead. Now, UK. The UK is has been turning out to be a very, very difficult economy to understand in some important ways, though not in the ways that people think. There was nothing mysterious at all about the pickup in growth in 2013, 2014. If you look at what happened to the fiscal side, the big austerity moves of the first 2 years did not continue. If you take do a scatter plot of fiscal policies versus growth rates for advanced countries, the UK's experience the last 2 years has been squarely on that line, just about what you would have expected. So there's no mystery there. The mystery is there's something very strange about the relationship between output and employment. And I'll get to that, I think, in a second, if I've got my slide order correct. In many respects, the UK is giving off the signals of an economy that is still very depressed. So if I were looking at many of the numbers, if I were looking at inflation, I would say, gee, inflation is low and dropping. I still remember when for a while there, those numbers were kind of elevated, and there were those of us who said, wait, it's temporary things, it's the rise in VAT, it's the depreciation of the pound, were ridiculed quite a lot. You know, you guys will, by the time you decide it's actually time for the Bank of England to raise rates, Britain will have double-digit inflation. Well, actually not. It has, in fact, come down, and it's continuing, as far as we can tell, to slide. So it's looking like an economy with excess capacity where inflation is still ratcheting down. By those numbers, the UK looks weaker than the United States in terms of employment, though not as weak as Europe. Interest rates in the UK, they are higher than in Europe, but they're still very low by historical standards. And real interest rates, so it turns out that the Bank of England has these cute, nifty little charts of implied. So those are implied interest rates, real interest rates adjusted for expected inflation, because the UK has index bonds, that are going well forward. And the point is, it's all negative. So Britain is looking like an economy where in real terms, people are willing to pay the government to hold their funds. And that's a mark of an economy that is certainly depressed or wanting to be depressed. It's not looking at all like normal times. If you were expecting if you want to think that Britain has anything like normal conditions, that's not what we used to think of as normal anyway. It's quite remarkable. That's Japanese type interest rates or worse. That's a bizarre from a historical point of view. However, employment is pretty good. And that's the really, really weird thing about Britain, which is that if all I knew was inflation, all I knew was interest rates, so if I had inflation and financial data, I would expect to see a quite strongly depressed economy. But if I look at the employment numbers, I see what looks like an economy that's doing reasonably well. And of course, what reconciles that, everybody knows, is that economic progress stalled officially. That all of the guess what? When did the iPhone come in? Just about. Yeah, so just about. So Britain, just about all technology from the iPhone onwards has had zero impact on the British economy. You've made no progress whatsoever, despite all of this stuff. Now, it's possible, actually, that I'm willing to believe that the iPhone is a destructive technology. But anyway, I know some teenagers. But anyway, actually adults too. But that's quite remarkable. And there are two interpretations. One is that that it's kind of a disguised depression. That something has that really there are not enough jobs, and so one way or another people are semi-employed or it's disguised unemployment. And I keep on waiting to see all these good economists here, and I know that there are some people who have done a lot of work, but just one definitive thing to explain to me what's happening. Is it just lots and lots of people calling themselves consultants and working out of their basements, or what is it? And I don't know the answer, but that's one possible answer. It might be certainly an important part of it. The other is that, in fact, for some reason, there really has been a catastrophic, pretty much unprecedented stall in productivity growth, which is more or less unique to Britain. Although we're not doing great, by the way, in productivity growth in the United States. That one of the interesting things about the current environment is people talk as if we're going in a white-hot technological revolution where the robots are taking all of our jobs, and then you look at the actual productivity numbers and you don't see any of that. But so that's one of the possibilities. But what I would say is that in terms of the policy implications, at some level they should be about the same, whichever interpretation you put on it. Because ask yourself, what can you do about, suppose that it really is productivity. What can we do about it? And the answer is by and large, that we don't know. We're not very good, actually. If you ask how do we make economies grow faster, not in the short run through business cycle recoveries, but over the longer run, the answer is, well, we have a lot of different stories and a lot of evidence which mostly falls apart once you kick it hard. Actually, my favorite remark about that actually was about Britain. Was Bob Solow, my old teacher, great U.S. economist. It was in a discussion of the long-term British productivity lag. The number of generations during which Britain fell behind the United States and some of continental Europe. And he said all attempts to explain that lag end in a blaze of amateur sociology. So there is something, but if there's one thing we think that you can do, it is investment. Investment in infrastructure, investment to some extent in education, possibly, although I think this is more of a U.S. concern, but investment in things like child nutrition and so on. In the United States, we're getting a lot of, we're having one of those periodic moments when we take a look at ourselves and say, what the hell are we doing to our children? And realizing that there are still lots of children in the United States who are being exposed to lead paint and receiving inadequate nutrition and health care, and that's not good for future GDP. So there are a lot of other reasons to be appalled. But certainly investment in a broadly defined is what you should be doing. And you ask, well, can you afford it? And the answer is, well, interest rates appear to be, with negative real interest rates, what better time to invest a lot in the future? And on the other hand, if you think that this productivity thing is not real in some sense, that we're actually looking at the disguised reality of an economy that's still depressed and a labor market that, although the top line numbers look good, is still one with a lot of disguised unemployment, then public investment programs, debt-financed public investment programs, would be exactly what you would want to do. They would be a way of increasing demand and putting the economy together. So, at least as I see it, even though there's some deep mystery going on here, we don't quite understand what's going on with the numbers. The mystery is one where the two, not necessarily mutually exclusive resolutions of the mystery, both suggest that you want a major program of public investment, which is, of course, not more or less the opposite of what has been happening in recent years. So it's been all wrong. Which brings me back to my original point. If you're looking for reasons to be concerned, first of all, there is something is going terribly wrong with all of the Western economies. We're all depressed. All of us are far, far below where we thought we were going to be if you go back to before the financial crisis. Actually, it's not even the advanced economies. We talk about the emerging economies and say, well, they've done much better, and they have in absolute terms. But if you compare, you can take projections that were made by reasonable consensus projections about growth even in China and India back circa 2007 and compare them with where those economies are now, and they are comparably far below. So we're all 8, 10, 12% below where we were supposed to be in terms of GDP. So that in itself is something that's deeply disturbing. The thing is that it can be made much worse if we misread what it was that happened. If the view on Britain is that what Britain had was a problem of public debt triumphantly solved through austerity policies, and the economy is healed and has returned to growth, that's totally missing what looks like a very severe failure of some kind in the economy. It's totally missing the need for investment one way or another as a way out. And it leaves the economy really pretty intellectually naked in the face of any adverse shocks. So if something happens, make up some wild scenario, Greece defaults. Think about all the China goes. You can make up lots and lots of stories. There are enough dangers out there that having a clear head in confronting what will happen if any one of them comes to pass is really important. So that's my take on it. Now, if I was doing this in the United States, I would have all kinds of further comments on micro issues that, if I don't actually know something about, at least in the US, I can fake them. But I can't do that here, so I'm going to leave that to my friends and colleagues up here. I forgot to say, by the way, thanks so much to the Sanjay Alal Trust and to Ronnie for making this visit to this wonderful place for a second time possible. Thanks so much.
Yeah, you'll have a chance to make those comments about the microeconomy during questions, I'm sure. Martin.
So first of all, it's a tremendous pleasure and honor to be here. I was a friend and great admirer of Sanjaya. We had our occasional disagreements and agreements, and I always thought he was one of the most delightful people I've known. I have the honor of having been invited to participate in one of these events once before. I think it was at Amartya Sen. I think one must say one meets a very high standard of company through this event. And I would never come now for anyone who isn't a Nobel laureate. In addition, I regard Rani and her family as friends, and so that makes an even greater pleasure. And of course, to be here with Paul and David is an enormous honor. I have to say, in addition, that I find it slightly strange that Paul should be the warm-up act for me. It seems the wrong way round. What I'm going to do is go through some more slides, more intensely than Paul is, and I think the way you think of them as complementary to what he has said. My basic view is that the British economy is in appalling shape. I have made this point in many different ways, and I'm extremely concerned about our future. He was too polite to say this because he's a guest, but it's what he meant. In other words, we seem to have all the problems the US has and a few others too, the most important of which he's mentioned. Since it's complementary, I will be going over some of the same territory, but I am happy to know that David is going somewhere else, and that will make it an even richer discussion. So I'm going to basically divide my talk into two parts. The first is where we are, and I'm going to focus on 5 challenges, some of which Paul has mentioned and some of which he hasn't. And then I'm going to go very quickly over at least some of the agenda of what a government might do if it was run by sane people, but it isn't. So obviously, it is going to get worse. I'm reasonably confident of that, but maybe not irreparably so. We will see. Okay, first, this is very much complementary where the British economy is now. I've used this chart, or charts like it, in my previous columns. This shows real GDP per head in the UK since 1955. That'll do for this purpose. I've also got charts which go back to 1870. Very interesting, but that's neither here nor there. The red line shows actual real GDP. The blue line is simply a fitted exponential trend, rather a good fit, actually. I'm not going to dare to get into R-squareds and things with David here. He can tell me later how absurd this is. But a simple trend fitted up to the end of 2007 and run forward. The green line should be read off the right-hand side, and it shows the deviation from the trend as a proportion of the trend. And it shows, of course, that the economy isn't completely stable. It oscillates a lot. We've had some quite big booms and some quite big recessions, and the green line indicates that. By the way, and that's itself a whole discussion, in 2007 and 8, it did not appear, and it does not even appear ex post, that we were way above trend. And there were lots of other reasons not to believe that we were way above trend, though there were some to believe it. It seems to me even now forgivable that people didn't realize the problems ahead. That's a whole set of other issues which I won't be able to go into. Anyway, the major point is to watch the green line and the red lines together, and you can see we're now 15% of GDP below trend, so that's an enormous, colossal negative shock. As far as I can see in the historic data, in terms of cumulative deviation from the past trend, it's worse than the interwar period. Think about that. The Second World War was a positive economic shock, so we don't need to go there. And we have not yet got back to trend in GDP per head. We have not even got back to the level of GDP per head of 2006. So this is a big mess. Regarding this as a policy failure, and I've made this a policy success, strikes me as simply insane. This is to underline another aspect of what Paul said, which is the UK has been considerably less productive than the US on a GDP per head basis, and there are many comments to make on that. This is at purchasing power parity, so adjusted for differences in relative prices, so on a common basis. And the UK has been in the sort of 70% range vis-a-vis the US for actually quite a long time in the post-war period. Our GDP per head grew roughly in line. In the 2000s, we had a bit of a recovery relative to the US, and we've lost it all. And the US, as Paul has rightly said, has had a pretty poor productivity record too. So it was, by the way, just a year ago or so that the Chancellor made what I still regard as the single most stupid remark made by a Chancellor in my lifetime. I wasn't around for Winston Churchill as Chancellor, which was that by 2030, Britain would be the most productive G7 economy, major economy in the world. We would surpass the US. As far as we know, we have been poorer, less productive in the US since at least 1870 and probably earlier. So, and the recent trends do not support this vainglorious absurdity. Now, this productivity challenge is absolutely fundamental, and I am going to just throw in an interesting chart which a colleague of mine, I don't regard this as the definitive answer, but it's a very interesting look at what Chris Giles did. I often disagree with Chris, but this seemed to me a very helpful thing. Chris just asked the question of where were the sectors where the rate of growth of productivity had fallen below the previous trend. So he looked at that. And when you look at that, it turns out that a hell of a lot of it is in finance, banking, professional services, things of that kind. There are other elements. It's not in retail, for example, a bit of in manufacturing, which is quite interesting, but a lot of it is in finance, banking, professional services of various kind. And I put forward the hypothesis, I have the hypothesis in my mind, I'm not saying it is correct, that the statistical offices are confusing a decline in our ability to extract rent from the rest of the world with a decline in productivity. They're just as productive as they were before in these activities, but idiots abroad are not prepared to pay as much as they used to for their services, and we think that decline in pay is actually a decline in productivity. Or as I joked in 2007, it was a sick joke, the problem the UK has is that it has a comparative advantage in a rent-extracting industry, and the world has noticed. But anyway, this raises some very interesting questions about our future, and it is possibly one clue to what's going on. The third big challenge, and since John Mulbauer is, I think, in the audience, has to be mentioned, and it is unique to us, is our sensational and colossal housing catastrophe. I'm just going to have a couple of charts on this. The first of which, and I'll just add to this, we have, according to a recent excellent paper from the LSE, the most expensive housing in the developed world, except for Monaco. Our new houses are significantly smaller than those built in comparably European countries, about 40% the size. 40% smaller, sorry, not 40%, but 60% the size. And they have become increasingly unaffordable. This is the data on price-earnings ratios in the UK as a whole, and the black line is a fitted trend, and you can see that as far as the trend is, there's lots of oscillations. They've doubled. In London now, the ratio is 8 times earnings for purchasing houses on average. You will see, in addition, and it's a very important fact about our economy, that we never went below trend during the crisis, and we're now moving way back above it. So we haven't changed this. Mervyn King had the joke at one stage, which I thought was very nice, is that the only thing that saved the British economy in the crisis is we never built any houses. So we didn't have the collapse in house building comparable to Spain and the US, very big collapse in house building, very negative, and we didn't have the comparable wealth effects. But the downside of this upside is it's impossible for most young people to buy a house, and this, I think, has very negative effects on mobility and many other social consequences, which are very severe. The reason for this is we have a failed market. Despite these incredibly high prices and very rapid rises in prices, the fastest rises in house prices in Europe by far, house building has been steadily declining. Of course, part of that is because local authority housing, some of us can remember the time when we built 300,000 houses a year. I did a thesis on housing actually in 69, 70, so I remember this period very well. It's partly because local authority housing has collapsed and the housing associations have not replaced it. The new Conservative proposals for the right to buy for housing associations are going to kill them, I think, inevitably, so that'll go. But even more interestingly, despite these unbelievably high prices, the private sector isn't building, and that's basically, I think, because of our land use policy, or more precisely, our anti-land use policies. So the market is utterly broken in land and housing, one of the most important markets for any economy. And my remark I've made about that is that it's rather difficult to say we have a dynamic market economy in this country when we don't have it for land and housing. A further issue, which I think fits very, very well with what Paul said, but is a complement to it, is severe sectoral imbalances. And that bears on the future of demand and debt, which I'm going to come to in a moment. So, everybody knows, household, corporate, public, and the rest of the world, balances must add up. These, by the way, come from an absolutely unimpeachable source, the Office for Budget Responsibility. I didn't make these up. This is their latest forecast, and people haven't shown from their March budget analysis. People don't look at these often enough because they're very, very revealing. We know that there was a huge recession, and we know that during the huge recession, the household sector and the private sector and the corporate sector moved massively into surplus, which is exactly what you'd expect them to do for the reasons that Paul has already explained. Interestingly and disturbingly, despite a huge real depreciation, about 20%, no swing of any significance occurred in the external balance. Indeed, it's got progressively worse. I'm going to come to that in a moment. And the offset to sustained demand was this huge swing into fiscal deficit, which was appropriate, necessary, and right, and prevented us from going into a Great Depression. The government has since then, in no way consistently, you can see there are two stages of tightening, has tightened fiscal policy somewhat. Roughly half the deficit has been eliminated. And the question, of course, is what is the offsets? And the offsets have been a massive swing towards balance, or swing towards balance of the household and corporate sector, and an adjustment in the perverse direction of the external sector. Why am I going over this at such length? Well, just look at what these forecasts tell you. What the forecasts of the OBR are saying is that even if we have a significant improvement in the external balance, really quite an optimistic one, more than halving, if the fiscal policy of this present government is delivered, it is necessary, if we're going to have a reasonably dynamic economy, for not only for the household and corporate sector to go into deficit in a big way, but to go in a deficit by massively increasing their spending. And the way to do that, in our experience, is to have an asset price boom and a hell of a lot of borrowing. The debt position has to get worse, and it has to get a lot worse. And to show this, again, this complements Paul, I think, beautifully. These are the OBR's forecasts for household debt. They've become a little less pessimistic, but basically the OBR is assuming, in order for the government's policy to add up, that the household debt ratio will go back to an all-time record by 2020. This is a necessary condition for this plan, this long-term plan, quote unquote, that the Chancellor is so proud of, to balance our economy given our enormous external difficulties. Now, obviously, a key question is why the current account has been so stuck. There are two elements that I'm going to focus on. I won't discuss the real exchange rate, except to note that we've lost about half the depreciation. And that's relatively recent, so that hasn't come through, and it's one of the reasons I think the OBR is too optimistic. Though the recovery in the Eurozone, if sustained and strong, will help enormously. So that might make me a little more optimistic. But the main point here is for you to see that the yellow, which is the balance of trade in goods and services, is essentially, since the crisis, not improved at all. Despite the real depreciation, it's improved a little, but really remarkably little. The income balance has collapsed. And that's consistent with the fact that if you look at our net income, it's basically largely income from assets. The UK, as I wrote about this about 8 years ago, is a huge hedge fund. We have huge assets and huge liabilities in aggregate. And historically, we've tended to earn more on our assets than we pay on our liabilities. And our ability to do this, which is in the nature of hedge funds, has stopped. There are risks in this. We've earned more on our assets than we paid on our liabilities. This was not Pache, some well-known American economists or people at Harvard who argue for the US, this is a free lunch. This is not a free lunch. And so we lost that position. And a key question for the current account is not whether the real trade balance improves. I suspect it won't. It's been stuck like this for 20 years. It's going to have to change in a big way, and I don't know where it would come from, is whether the net foreign income will improve. And that depends essentially on much higher returns on our foreign assets. All those interest rates abroad will go up like mad, while ours stay very low, and I can't see how that will happen. So if that's the case, the assumption of the current account improvement, which is central to the forecast I've given you, is implausible. And if that's the case, the sectoral imbalance problem I have described is even worse than the OBR thinks, in which case we are, to put it technically, screwed. That then leaves us to the fiscal side, and I'm going to come to a conclusion very quickly. It's a complement to what you said before. This is my favorite chart in the whole world, and I've got rid of one element in it. This is Britain's public debt over GDP since 1692. There aren't that many charts that go back to 1692. The red line shows bank rate, and the blue line shows net public debt. There are only two things you have to notice about this chart. The first is, by British historical standards, we have no net public debt. None. We are way below average historically. The financial crisis was not insignificant, as you can see. It pushed it up, but it's not as expensive quite as a world war. Though I do like to remark the financial sector is almost as expensive as a world war. And the other point to make, which is utterly consistent with Paul, I could have done the same with long rates, though it's not quite long real rates, is short rates are lower than they've ever been before in history. That's a very, very interesting combination. The most interesting conclusion I reached from this is that the idea we were in a public debt crisis was a fantasy. this is what the government has done. The government said, and this again underlines this is what the government said would happen to the current cyclically adjusted current budget in its original June 2010 forecast, and the blue line shows what actually happened. And that's more or less exactly what he said. There was some tightening, then it slowed, then it was some tightening, but this time it tells us it's serious. So the blue line is what it says it's going to do, and all the questions he and I have raised about the economy under that sort of fiscal tightening, if it's actually delivered, which it probably won't be, arise. The government didn't deliver what it promised. Its argument that it did is just twaddle. But if it does deliver what it promised, which is a fiscal adjustment entirely on the spending side, total managed expenditure relative to GDP collapsing to 36%. This would deliver the lowest ratio of public spending to GDP since the war, with exception of 2 previous years, 99, 2000, 56, 57. They didn't last. This won't last either. The red line that the government has just announced is, in my view, fantasy numbers. So, we are governed by incompetence and the economy is in complete mess. What can we do about this? Well, here are 5 suggestions for what might be done by an intelligent government. It would borrow enormously to invest. It might not generate huge long-term productivity growth, but it is worth noting, as Paul has mentioned, you need to be pretty pessimistic about your capacity to find decent investments if you can't find decent investments when your 30-year real interest rate is -1. 30-year. And you're worried about borrowing? We're crazier than the Germans. We need to give much stronger support to innovation. That's a key element. I think there are a lot of American initiatives of the past. We need a DARPA. There's a lot of things we could be trying and doing to be more imaginative. I'm going to throw this in. A lot of our problems relate to the inability of the corporate sector to invest productively, consistently, particularly, and that relates to corporate governance and the financial sector's role in corporate governance. Since Colin is here, I think, that's a very important theme in my view. We've got a dysfunctional corporate sector, and that's part of the reason we got in the mess. We need to shift the taxation structure. We need more revenue, and the obvious place to get it is from land, which has increased massively in value. Half of our net worth is land, and it should be taxed. And of course, we need a complete and total reconstruction of land use planning. None of this will happen, of course, and that's why 5 years from now, in my view, and I'm very pessimistic, depressed about it, we're going to be in worse shape than today. Thank you.
Okay, David. That's terrific.
Thanks to Annie for inviting me to participate in this debate. I kind of guessed what the 2 other speakers would talk about, but I hadn't guessed it would be quite so close to what I was going to say. The only disagreement I have with Martin is I do think all his slides should have gone back to 1650 if had the data, and you'll find a large number of mine go back a very long way, because I'm going to look at longer run proposals, not things we can do that will have an effect now, but things we can start now that will have an effect that might get us out of the problems I see further down the road, and to understand that we need long run data. So what can we do now? We face world problems, domestic problems, European problems. But many of these problems are going to have very long run and very dramatic effects. Climate change is the largest, globalization and aging are the next 2. Europe, if we were to leave that, and immigration was to change dramatically, we'd have to adjust enormously in the UK. We have a huge range of domestic problems, inequality, high house prices, and credit-funded expenditure. The last 2 were addressed by the previous speakers. National debt, Martin's just shown you graphs, very like the ones I'm going to show you. Financial instability, which hasn't gone away. Stagnant productivity, both speakers addressed that. Balance of payments deficits, Martin talked on that. And unemployment facing disruptive technological change. So there's a consistent, persistent set of problems facing the lost generation. And looking around this room, I see a lot of the lost generations. Thatcher's children who didn't benefit from what she did. So the structure of my talk is, what are the problems? What is the evidence? What are the possible solutions? It'll be evidence-based. I'll go through graphs very rapidly. You've seen some examples of them. Mine are a bit longer and a bit more complicated, but I hope they're understandable. We should try to adopt each policy to offset other problems. So if we see a problem like immigration, we try to use that instead of it being a problem to solve national health care, old age care, for example, changing the age structure of the population. So we could, for example, introduce tax reforms that simultaneously reduce the deficit, reduce the housing bubble, and reduce inequality, so we can trade problems off against each other. Very long-term horizon, because adjustment costs are enormous. Many governments don't understand just how big they are, but planning is very slow. Many projects take years to come to fruition, so we need to start now for projects to be ready when needed. And both speakers have stressed exactly the same thing. At negative interest rates, what rates of return do you need on investments to make them pay, particularly if you're going to fix it for 30 years? So let me start with the biggest problem of all, climate change. Atmospheric climate levels over the last 800,000 years are shown in panel A. I've put in a few ice ages to show you they come about when CO2 drops and the warming periods when CO2 rises. And right alongside are the CO2 measures started in 1958 at Mauna Loa, and they are exploding. That's not just an upward trend, it's an accelerating upward trend. And to show you that in the graph B, I've put in the trend line around the changes in CO2 emissions, and it is rising. So not only are we not doing anything about it, we're making it much worse, and we're already way above anything seen over the last 800,000 years. Now, what matters is the change. The world's fantastically good at adjusting at a given level, but moving from one level to another level has led to the great extinctions through history. And along the top of the graph, just under climate change long run and now, I've put in all the articles that you can click on when the slides are online to see the evidence in detail. And what's happening to the temperature? The global temperature is rising, but the Arctic temperature is rising very dramatically. And there's a complete ecology will be destroyed if there's no old ice, because the old ice has the creatures, the tiny organisms that feed the whole ecology of the Arctic. And if that goes and we lose all of that, that is going to be a serious problem for humanity. And also the oceans are warming fairly fast and fairly dramatically. Now, I'm not trying to address what the world should do about it, but what should the UK do to protect itself from what looks like a looming crisis? We need water conservation, we need food security, and we need renewable energy. So my suggestion in water conservation that creates a bit of questioning amongst a number of people is we should dam the Wash. The Wash is that huge indentation about 50 miles north of Cambridge, that other place, and it's got 600 square kilometres of currently salt water. The southeast of England is going to desiccate. We're going to get monsoons followed by droughts. We need storage, and the only place I can see left in Britain to get massive increases in storage is to dam it, build a road across it, and get the whole east coast of England regenerated. How are we going to deal with food? Well, we're already farming fantastically efficiently in Britain, very few people, huge output. We start to need vertical farms. Vertical farms because they're right in the centre of city, there's no transport costs, there's no water usage, there's no fertilizer usage, they recycle everything and the buildings can get energy from the sun to feed themselves. The falling costs in LED and construction will make this more viable as food prices rise, as other countries begin to realise the problems of climate change. We need to mandate more marine reserves and saltwater fish sanctuaries, which happen at the moment to be an incidental benefit of offshore wind farms, and we need nuclear power. Now, nuclear power has killed fewer people per kilowatt generated than any other form of energy, from hydro, gas, oil, coal, you name it. It's vastly safer, even than solar cells and windmills. Now, we have two new forms coming on stream that the government ought to invest very heavily in. One is molten salt waste burners, which take all that nuclear waste we're all worried about what to do with, reburn it, and they get it down by about 95%. And indeed, the waste from that can be put back into conventional nuclear power plants to generate more energy, almost eliminating the transuranic residual that we don't want to know how, well, we don't know how to deal with at the moment. And the other is, you've heard about nuclear submarines. My countrymen don't want them nearby. They have not had nuclear accidents. That's a fantastically safe technology. We could build 6,000 or 7,000 of them and learn as we build them to build them incredibly cheaply to get our nuclear energy directly from tiny, they're about the height of a human being, by the way, very small, but you could put 500 together. And for Hinkley Point, you could get an enormous number of small ones, much safer, much more manageable. And I also expect dramatic falls in renewable energy costs. So that's what I want to say about climate change. Globalization. Now, globalization's been phenomenal. It's been around since about 5000 BC, but recently it's accelerated. And the red line shows the world income distribution in 1820, the blue 1970, and the green 2000. And it's moved out fantastically. We've got rid of the bulge of rich and poor. It's much more symmetrically distributed, and it's very much further to the right. So the world is very much better off, although there's still 1 billion people living in poverty, as Paul Collier has recently reminded us. Now, we're aging. We're aging because we're living longer. We're living longer by a weekend a week. Every week you live a weekend longer than anybody else has ever lived in this planet. Right? It's fantastic how rapidly that happened after 1860. And fortunately, at least for people like me, 70 is the new 60. So what can we do about this? Well, the first thing we can do is index retirement age for state pensions to the average age of death. It was introduced originally for people who were, by bad luck, lived beyond the time they could work. So they got a pension to stop them starving to death in the streets. We need to mitigate the future costs of unfunded commitments because it's the lost generation who are going to have to pay those further down the road. We need to reform FRS 17 to allow decent returns to be made in private pensions. We need to adjust healthcare and old age provision, and immigration can help there. It's not just a problem of people coming in and consuming houses and services. They provide output as well. They're a younger cohort than the current average British population, and they can help balance our pyramid. But we must improve human capital throughout life. Okay, I'm an academic, that's self-serving, but I'm not going to be around to benefit from it, so I think I can legitimately tell you, you need education throughout life because the world has been changing rapidly, and that will speed up. So let's get to the domestic issues. Population. British population is shown in graph A with local trend lines. There's 7 separate trend lines because the trends have varied hugely over time, and recently we're in one of the fast upturns. Live births has cycled dramatically. Recently they've risen. It's quite extraordinary that in about 2002 we knew how many children were being born, and we could see many, many more were being born each year, but we did nothing to make sure schools were available 5 years later when they got to that age. Deaths have been falling dramatically in Britain. This is the aging phenomenon. We're down from 700,000 when the population was about 50 million to about 550,000 when the population is 65 million. So the death rate has dropped dramatically. And what have we done? Well, as Martin's pointed out, we didn't build any houses to treat these people. It's fallen from 450,000 a year to about 125,000 a year. Ratio of national debt to nominal GDP, you've seen that from 1650. I have that data as well, but most of my data is 1860 to today. And panel A shows that we are still below the average of even that period. And if you went back to the Napoleonic Wars, the graph going off to the left gets higher and higher and higher until it gets to the same level as the Second World War. Now, what surprises most people is graph B. Graph B shows us the change in real national debt. And I've put in the salient events, the Boer War, World War I. I haven't marked the stupidity of the government after World War I and Churchill coming into power. Then World War II, the oil crisis. Do you know John Major is responsible for the largest ever increase in real national debt? Not the present government, not the previous government, not Tony Blair, John Major. At the same time, we have to worry that the government under Thatcher threw away family silver. She didn't really help by selling it off at the prices she did, other than a few people who were around at the time to benefit. But from 1960 to 1979, government share of net wealth went from very negative to highly positive. And that would have been a real bonus as a safety net in times like now. But Thatcher sold it off. Tony Blair tried to recover. Gordon Brown and then the present government's finally filled it off. And Martin's already talked about long-term interest rates. They're unconnected to debt. They're only connected to inflation. Inequality. Now, I want just to stress one thing about inequality. Redistribution can have an impact. The top graph shows the Gini coefficients for UK and US before distribution, and the bottom graph shows after distribution. And in the UK, we've stabilized inequality over about the last 20 to 30 years. However, the share going to the top 1% in the Anglo-Saxon countries has exploded. It's gone back to 1900 levels. And it's not a global effect because it hasn't happened in continental Europe and Japan. It's specifically an English language country effect, and it's probably the robber barons that run our big companies that have taken it away from the next generation. Tackling increasing inequality. Sir Tony Atkinson has told us how to do it. Go read his book. Productivity growth. I've gone back to 1860 for productivity growth because I want to make a number of points. First of all, I've put an ellipse around the present. It's the longest, largest stagnation we've had, and that includes all the major events over the last 150 years. I've also put in the log of capital and local trends. And if you look at the recent, that is 1980 onwards, the so-called efficiency of privatization, etc., it's flattened off dramatically. And indeed, it's one of the lowest apart from the end of the 19th century and the interwar period. But the most astonishing one I want you to take note of is graph C. Graph C is a 25-year moving average of the change in output per person per year. That's British GDP growth divided by the number of people working. It dropped throughout the 19th century. That used to be called the Great Depression, reaches a trough after the First World War, and then throughout what was called the American Great Depression, it rises dramatically through nationalization, reaches a peak in 1978, and then it's plunged right back down again. This stagnating productivity is not new. It's been falling since 1975 or thereabouts. It's a very long run, very worrying phenomenon. And then finally, I've put real wage growth and the subsample means with one spike that you can see. And I want to make the point that A, it doubled suddenly after 1945. It's really sudden. I'll show you that's been tested econometrically. And the spike in 1940 was engineered by the government to get people who weren't in the armed forces into the factories and farms. And it had a major effect and probably helped Britain win the Second World War. So to increase real wages, we need productivity growth. Real wages have tracked productivity throughout. Technical progress is the key driver. We're now mainly a service economy. The only technical progress is in human capital. We've really got to improve human capital, but we've got to maintain the incentive for physical capital investment, and we have to build effective real infrastructures and effective digital infrastructures. We also need to plan for rapid and potentially disruptive technological change, mitigate its costs and spread its benefits. We don't want modern Luddites running around. And we need to ensure that all the technological change that's going on, which is really very, very rapid, driverless vehicles, robotic producers, biotech, 3D printing, nanoscale, new materials. Yes, but we also need all the new skills for people to go in and develop those and to make the machines and look after the machines. So we need to educate new skills for new jobs. Unemployment. Unemployment remains at 16% or so for those in the 16 to 24 age bracket. It's not as bad as Spain and Italy, but it's pretty darned bad. Now, the unemployment rate in Britain has fluctuated greatly since 1860. The Great Depression, as economic historians used to call it, is this high patch around 1900. It plunges at the First World War. You can get unemployment down from 9% to 0 in 1 year if you can be bothered. Then it rockets again. You can get it up again to 10% in a year if you can be bothered. It jumps a little bit with the American Great Depression. Then, as you can see, it comes straight back down for 1939, 1940. It's very low during the interwar period and then rises with the oil crisis and the conservative governments of the 1980s and early 1990s. And it's coming down now, but it's still very high. It's about above the average over the historical period. Now, the more interesting graph is the right-hand one. And this is one that takes a little bit of interpretation. I've got the unemployment rate along the bottom axis from nothing to 15%. That's what we've experienced historically, as you can see in the left-hand graph. And along the vertical axis, I've got the impact of unemployment on real wages. How big is the impact? And if we start off at the very lowest unemployment rates we've observed, real wages rise about 1.5% per annum when we get that low level of unemployment. Then as unemployment rises, the impact of unemployment on real wages declines until it goes negative. And that's the loss of bargaining power of workers. But beyond 8%, it goes back up again. And that's moving back down the marginal product curve. And when we get to 15% unemployment, we see that real wages are going up about 1% per annum. They must be involuntarily unemployed. There is no way they're taking a holiday, as some silly North American economists have argued for high unemployment. If they were willing to work when unemployment was 2.5 for that gain, they'd be willing to work now. It's unequivocal evidence that it's involuntary unemployment on average in the UK, and the Jarrow Marches are a clear example of that. I might skip this graph very quickly. Martin's discussed it. Real mortgages have risen much faster than real house prices, and the house price to income's exploded. House price to income ratio has exploded. It stayed very high. It's a major problem for the lost generation because housing brings everything with it. It's where you live, it's your schooling, it's access to financial markets, etc. So, what tax reforms do we need? I think the very first, which I've talked to many of the heads of the civil service over the years, phase out the tax deductibility of interest payments on debt. We have to get rid of it. We could do it over a decade or even over 20 years, either by 10% per annum or 5% from 100 down to 0. But while interest rates are low, it's costless to start this reform now. To reduce the debt subsidy that encourages companies to hold more debt rather than equity. It'll help financial stability, so we won't have banks that are 90% debt, but actually 90% equity. And it will avoid the massive fall in tax revenues we'll have as interest rates rise, and all these companies and individuals can deduct their interest payments. We need to merge taxes and benefits. We have to stop this idiocy that if your income goes up by £1, you lose all your child benefits. If it goes up by £2, you lose your personal entitlement, etc., and have a very smooth marginal tax rate by adding them together and taxing them at the individual's rate, which would also limit the benefits for the highest earners. We need to reform council tax. John Mobar's written at some length about it. We need to create a national land bank so the government's able to support housing and mandate that things can be built on. What we need is not a right to buy, but a right to build and to borrow its low rates for social housing. And we need to charge the standard rate of VAT on everything. Having all these millions rate of VATs, if it's heated, it's one rate, if it's not heated, it's another. It's really stupid. And if necessary, change the way we hand out allowances to households. For example, putting it in household fuel, which would hugely help tackle climate change. We can still give people a winter fuel allowance, but to all households. We also should be raising fuel duty to offset the fall in oil prices. We wouldn't then have very low inflation. So what conclusions do I draw? We have to base policy on empirical evidence. That seems such an obvious statement, and it's just counter to what this government's done throughout. The evidence is quite clear, and it's nothing like they think it is. Right? They keep making these statements, as Martin says, we seem to be governed by amongst the stupidest people that have been in power in my lifetime. It reveals a very, very different picture from what is sometimes claimed. We need to solve some problems by policies that also solve other problems. We need to bang them together. Technology and infrastructure to raise productivity, create new jobs, and jointly tackle the impacts of climate change. We need immigration to offset an aging population, completely the opposite of the way this government views immigration. Turns out that Paul couldn't even get to stay here for the period he wanted because the immigration policy says you've got to go after 30 days. I mean, how absurd can this country get? We need tax reform to tackle the deficit, but it can simultaneously tackle inequality and house price bubbles and bring in appropriate local taxation through the council tax, and we need to improve human capital to reduce unemployment. And I think that would help stabilise both company debt and household debt. We need a very long-term horizon. We have to start now in most of these problems. It'll take 20, 30 years to get the wash changed. It'll take 20 years to get all the infrastructure in place for appropriate nuclear technology and to make sure it's safe enough. And we need to overfund because interest rates are astonishingly low. To be able to borrow at negative interest rates for 30 years, to invest in education, technology, and infrastructure, what more could you ask? There's some references, and thank you very much.
Good. Well, thank you all. For those of you who were cheerful when you came in, I feel there should be a sort of collective apology from people here. We're not called the Dismal Science for nothing. So we have a full 20 minutes or so for questions. I'm going to group questions together, so take 3 or 4 at a time, then turn to the panel to address them. If people can put your hand up if you want to ask a question, and try and ask questions, not make statements. So keep things fairly short, and say who you are and what your affiliation is as you start the question. That would be terrific. I'm setting grouping questions together, and notice that the panel don't have pieces of paper and pens in front of them, so maybe they've got better memory.
Terrific.
Anybody?
I've got it.
Oh, yes.
And pens. We've got pens and paper.
I'll get it autographed for you. Paper. No, it would,
Do you want a
We're
pen?
good.
No, he's got
no, I'm fine. You've got to field the questions, not me. Okay. Yeah, one up there.
Okay, my name is Paul Flabber. How can economists help us, the public, to better understand the real story? I think it is a depressing picture you painted, and clearly we misread the narrative. We were deliberately misled, if you like. But how can we better interpret and understand it? This kind of graphs cannot be used to talk to a very wide audience.
I am going to group some, but if you can hold the questions or write them down. Yeah. Yeah, at the back.
Hi, I'm wondering if you could address what students and people in this audience should be doing to address these problems if they realize, like you do, that so much of the policy is so misguided.
Okay, so yeah, one top left, yeah, in yellow.
Yes. David Steinsaltz, Department of Statistics. I have the impression that not everyone, not even all economists, would agree with everything that was said here. And I'm wondering what any of you thinks, why it is that economics finds itself in a position of such enormous differences in terms of the recommendations that are being made.
Well, I think that's possibly quite a good point to pause, because they're rather on the theme of communication and debate and how we should get it across. Paul, do you want to kick off?
Martin and I are both, at least partially, in the business of trying to reach a broader audience. And so let me actually take that, start with the last one. A large part of what I think people don't understand is how, of course, there are lots of disagreements among economists, but not as much as you think on these issues. In the U.S., we have a regular survey that's carried out by the Booth School at Chicago, which asked the question, did the Obama stimulus work, essentially? And did it in fact reduce unemployment? And the answer was 95% of the economists surveyed said yes, it did. And then there was Alberto Alesina. But but there was essentially no. And yet, in the U.S. political debate, if anything, people think there are two sides; they're equally strong, or if anything, the stimulus skeptics. And there have been some. The UK has some surveys which are not quite as overwhelming, but they're in the same general ballpark. And part of the answer is, of course, there's no licensing. I'm not sure there should be, but who's an economist and who do they work for? And in the UK, particularly to some extent in the US, but even more strikingly here, the difference between city economists and the academics is really very wide. And this brings us back to Upton Sinclair in the United States. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it, and that's a very very important part of many of these debates. Communicating. So, I mean, I think I have I write for a broader circulation, a different type of newspaper than Martin does, and so I really have to try. And I think I get messages across pretty well. I certainly I can't have as many graphs, actually any, to go with my columns, I think I do reasonably well at getting it across. But the trouble is that you have to always bear in mind how restricted is the audience that you can reach, no matter how well. I mean, the New York Times is the best commercial, the best journalistic real estate in the world.
which means that I managed to reach maybe 1.5% of the U.S. electorate. And the people and that's not condemning it. People have jobs, they have lives, they have children. They're not going to be consuming directly elite journalistic outlets. You have to reach them somehow. Ultimately, you have to influence the conversation more broadly, and that's a very hard row. I mean, Martin, yes, I don't tweet, by the way. I refuse. That's dangerous. I have a Twitter feed. There's a robot, so when I put up a blog post, a tweet goes out. And I do have a quite surprising number of followers, and if I can multiply that by 50, I'll be up there with Katy Perry. I mean, you just have to bear in mind how the world works. And then if on the policy, look, there's always lots of room for individual voluntary action. And even though you don't have another election for 5 years, governments are not totally unresponsive to public opinion. So if you can move the dialogue, move the consensus, it helps, at least at the margin. And it's funny, I'm in the position, I'm very unique. I'm the least cynical, caustic person on the panel today. I don't know if that's ever happened to me before. And I think the reason is I'm probably grading your government on a curve. Because when you talk about people being stupid and irrational and not looking at evidence, have you seen the bad side of politics in my country? I mean, I actually, for tomorrow's column, I have one of my lines is that having been involved in catastrophic policy failures is, at least on one side of the debate, actually a required credential. So,
Martin, you
go over the same ground because there's so much agreement, which is perhaps a bit depressing for the audience. On the last point, actually, if I compare with the Eurozone policy as run in Berlin and much of the policy making in Washington as run by Washington, I think actually London looks quite good. That's not a very high bar, but it is true. It is true. I have thought a lot, obviously, about how the public's understanding of economic issues and policy options can be formed, or is formed, and whether there is any way around the extraordinarily narrow range of what is seen as politically legitimate and sensible statements. And I honestly don't know. To me, the surprise, for example, on this last election is take the opposition, which you think has an interest in offering good and sensible alternative ideas. Some of the people involved in forming policy making in the opposition were not stupid, but they basically didn't address any important issues at all. Most of what they said was irrelevant, what was striking to me is that they felt it was suicidal to say anything that was regarded as the least bit challenging. So in fact, my criticism of them was that they were just unbelievably conservative. I mean, unbelievably conservative. So we had a huge public debate about whether the fiscal deficit, here we're talking about the overall balance, the public sector net borrowing, would be 0 or 2% in 2020. And I won't even go on how stupid that discussion is. So I don't know, but the clear conclusion I've reached is whatever I'm doing, I'm failing. So it's time for somebody else to take over, and I've been thinking about this. And that perhaps links to the question which we haven't addressed, which is what students need to do. Well, they need to get very much more active and engaged than they have been. I lived through the revolutionary student period. Now, most of us were morons, but at least we were actively engaged morons. The present generation seem to be completely disengaged. I don't know what's happening to them. Everybody tells me we live in this wonderful social media environment where we have the instantaneous feedback and movements of ideas and trending and all the rest of it. It seems to me just unbelievably depressing what is trending and the complete absence of any coherent analysis of societies which are in very, very difficult trouble. And finally, let me just, on the economists, I think Paul is being too kind to economists. but then I'm not a proper economist, so I can say that. They're clearly better on the whole than the journalists and the, with a few exceptions, and the city economists, I agree. But I do think, and I was one of them 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I was one of them, so I put my hand up, that there is still far too much of the idea among that things have to be grounded in theory, and to be grounded in theory, that means you need a fully specified model based on the rational maximizing individual, and the assumption is you've done it properly if you end up with a full private sector equilibrium. And this doesn't seem to me, this shapes the way economists think about the world, and the problem is it isn't a correct description of the world. So somebody like David, who actually starts from what the evidence, is a sort of revolutionary figure in economics, where most people, seems to me, even now in these policy debates, start from pure theory, which suffers from the major problem that it's wrong.
I want to weigh in with one more thing. I think I actually do have a bit more of an answer to the question of what you can do, basically what you can do between elections, because when I look at policy debates on economics and other things, what seems striking to me is that the U.S. center-left, I mean, our center, we don't have a center-right. We have a center-left, and we have an incredibly far-right, and that's it. And our far-right is, to use the technical term, batshit crazy. But but our center-left is a lot tougher now, and a lot more effective at making its case than it used to be, and also than the European center-left, including the UK, which has been amazingly just folds. And where did that come from? And I think the answer was it was built over time. During those 8 years of the Bush White House, when there was in fact an intellectual, a media infrastructure, and a lot of just organizing of people built a community so that which included media outlets, but it also included an awful lot of blogs, an awful lot of the framework was there, and now it's just all those years when the center left was excluded from Washington, all the years when actually the politicians were running like scared rabbits, as was the case for us 10 years ago, very much so. In fact, something was happening. In fact, the foundations were led for our healthcare reform. I mean, it's an insanely complex system. No one would have done it from scratch, but 15 million people who didn't have insurance have it. So I think that the answer is you don't give up. You try to build a movement. You try to build the foundation, because the wheel does turn, and there will be another chance. However hard it may be to see that just the week after the election.
David, I mean, getting the numbers out there. We've just been through an election campaign where we've been bombarded with numbers to the point where they're utterly meaningless. So getting the numbers out there.
Getting the numbers out. Yet, when I was asked to go on television to discuss the national debt, they refused to let me show my graph. They would not let me do that. They said nobody will understand it. And yet we're meant to be a literate, numerate population. And unless we show people graphs, we show them what the evidence is. I mean, I can waffle about it, as often happens with city economists, but I have the numbers. We have the numbers back to 1650. For GDP, we've got them back to 1328 now. We really have long-term, interesting numbers about this economy, what happens and how it happens, and they don't match what Martin's described as economic theory that I call fairyland economics. I mean, much of it is so absurd. One agent who's young and old, who's buying and selling the same asset, who's cheating their taxes and paying them willingly. I mean, it's an absurd view of the world. We need an economics that's dynamic, that deals with nonlinearities, adjustments, sudden abrupt shifts. You saw dozens of them in my talk. The kind of economics that's equilibrium has got nothing to do with the way the world works, and we need to move on. And that's what INET is all about. How do we move on from that kind of stuck-in-the-wool view of the Middle Ages, where very little happened in any given time? What can students do? Well, they can move. They can move into this kind of economics. They can take data more seriously. They can try and understand what class of models do you need to have data that behaves that way? Why is the long-term real interest rate unconnected to the level of national debt? Yet governments panic as soon as national debt starts going up. What is actually going on, and why?
Thank you. Time for one more round of questions, possibly two. Yeah.
Rafael Ramirez. I direct the Oxford Scenarios program. The question to each panelist is, could you give us a plausible reason to be optimistic? Each of you, please.
Yeah, Richard Hobbs from the MBA school here. Just a question. Sir David raised the point that climate change was an important aspect facing the UK economy. One thing which shows this is obviously true is that, before the election, Clegg, Cameron and Miliband signed a bipartisan agreement that regardless of the election outcome, they would both take strong action on climate change. This couldn't be further from the case in the US, where they are so far away from a bipartisan deal on climate change. Paul, in your opinion, what tangible steps could be made? What will it take for the US to start taking tangible action on bipartisan action on climate change?
Okay, there's one right in front of you. Two down. Can we?
Hi. So before the election, we were obviously given the polls saying that it would be an extremely tough race, and they were completely blown out the water. They were completely wrong. One of the arguments we're seeing quite a lot is that the left were belligerent and self-righteous, and that there were such a high number of shy Tories because Labour voters weren't necessarily saying, we disagree with you, they were just saying, you're wrong. Do you think there's a risk that the anti-austerity argument could be branded with the same image of self-righteousness?
At the right front.
Warren, I just wanted, none of your graphs really addressed, well, I think there was one, income inequality, which I'm interested in. Yes, no, you did. But actually I'm interested in income inequality in the UK going forward, because people vote, I think, partly in terms of how they think they're going to do and what's going to happen to them and what they think is going to happen with the economy. But I just wondered what you think will happen with income inequality and how that might actually change people's perceptions of the future.
Okay, I'm going to invite the panel to respond to these, and I think we'll get one more very quick round in. I mean, David, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Scenarios, go read Our World in Data. We have a website done by Max Roser, run out of my institute, that is everything optimistic about the world, and almost everything in it is genuinely optimistic. Falls in death rates, increasing longevity, reductions in child mortality, reduction of disease, reduction in autocracies versus democracy, an enormous amount to be optimistic about. These are local problems. Climate change is the most serious of them, but we could deal with it. We could set up a world fund, 150 billion, 500 billion, pay out big prizes for people to do innovations. I've written at some length about it, but the trouble is people are so siloed that nobody seems to read these things. Tangible steps, that's tangible steps for dealing with climate change. Anti-austerity, yeah, well, I'm not surprised. I mean, if you were a mother with 3 kids and your benefits were suddenly removed, you'd be anti-austerity too. And what can we do about inequality going forward? Well, read Tony's book. He gives you 15 proposals.
Okay, Martin.
Yeah, I think that's... we were asked to focus on the British economy, and I didn't think of the next 40 years. But I mean, David's most important point is, of course, I've written this in previously, that on the whole, the world is getting better, and much better. We have a few local difficulties, and the local difficulty is what we were talking about. But of course, if you were in China or India, the weight of experience will be strongly on the other side. And one should add to that, I tend to be less persuaded than some that we're in the unparalleled era of technological innovation. I don't think we are, but we are in an era of technological innovation. I'm going to leave the climate change question to Paul. I have no idea what happened in polls. The only thing I like about it is that it demonstrated that psephologists on a much better defined and simpler task were even worse at forecasting than economists. Good. But David might explain that. And I agree. I think income inequality is an interesting issue. but there's a limit to what I could say. The evidence seems to suggest, and it's in Tony, I think, and certainly David's mentioned it, that income inequality in the UK is high, but on at least some measures hasn't worsened for the last couple of decades. I would be unbelievably surprised. I would have to change all my priors if 5 years from now that was still true.
Okay. First, on optimism, it's, yes, actually technology, what's really interesting, and I think rather remarkably doesn't get as much press as it should. I mean, we're all talking about information technology, which is, of course, I mean, it's good, but how much it's really mattering is not clear at this point. That's the Peter Thiel's line. We were promised flying cars, instead we got 140 characters. But there is something really dramatic and revolutionary happening on energy technology, and especially renewables. And this is David mentioned this briefly, but that's a tremendous source of optimism, first of all, because it is a major form of technological progress in the material world, and secondly, because it suggests that avoiding a climate catastrophe is not nearly going to be nearly as hard as we thought, which doesn't mean that we will. We can still manage to screw it up. The one thing you should know about the US is that it does appear that quite a lot of action can be taken on climate through executive action. That you don't need a sane Congress to get, you don't need a sane House of Representatives. It would help if we have a sane Senate, which is something of a possibility. But you need a sane president. So it's enormously, the fate of the world may very well be at stake in 2016. And you should know, as a New York Times columnist, I don't do endorsements, so you don't know which party I favor. But if it is if she so chooses, whoever she might be, it's remarkable, particularly given that the technology is sliding in a favorable direction. Things that are within the realm of actions that the president can take, even without Congress, could make a huge difference. So that's a combination. That's an answer to both. Be damned if certainly if belligerence loses elections, that's kind of be news to the Senate Majority Leader and the Speaker of the House of Representatives. I've seen there's no penalty for that, and the idea that the problem of the British left was too much belligerence in this, as opposed to simply not having any sign of a spine. Anyway, yeah, inequality is complicated. I would be surprised. I mean, and what's one thing is just throw it in, globalization, particular form, I think does affect things. Britain is, or London. London is a global rentier city. London, and you can see it in New York, where it's true, but not quite to the same extent, and it's embedded in a much bigger country. But London is the place where the oligarchs, princelings, and sheikhs of the world come to park their ill-gotten wealth, and that ends up affecting the shape of this society as well. And it's in some ways just a lucrative business. I mean, so Britain can come from bilking people of their money through unproductive financial transactions, and instead move to providing safe havens for malefactors of great wealth from the world. But it's I think that's one reason to think that at least at the very top end, inequality will continue to rise here.
There are two people had their hands up. I'm going to take two more, and then sort of closing comments from the panel. We'll finish at sort of 5:02. We started a bit late, so yeah. And there was one over there, but Vijay.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm Catherine Costello from the Department of International Development. I wanted to elicit the panel's views on the deep mystery of the productivity lag or gap in the British labour market. And I was mindful of the fact that Professor Krugman said this topic ends in a blaze of amateur sociology, so maybe that's what we're going to get. But it seemed that there was a suggestion in some of your comments that it's because when we measure labour market productivity, we measure the wrong thing. Or is there also a more political explanation that we have a badly regulated labour market, which means workers are experiencing such a degree of insecurity and have such weak structures of collective and individual bargaining that their lives are horrible, so that therefore they're actually unproductive because they're struggling. So that's my bit of amateur sociology in the latter suggestion. So I'd like to elicit the reactions to that.
Well, they're clearly not going to get amateur sociology from this panel. So, I mean, concluding possible answers to those questions, but concluding comments. I mean, David, do you want to...
Well, I think the fall in growth is indeed global. As Paul put it, your income is my expenditure and my expenditure is your income. If we all go down, we all go down. And on the other hand, Asia is big enough that it could have an internal market. People forget that the US Great Depression, where the US fell by 30%, was followed by Europe having a Great Depression, created all by itself by letting Credit Anstalt go bankrupt. And Britain did not have a Great Depression. We had a jump in unemployment, but output only fell by about 3%. And that's because those two economies were pretty autarkic after the First World War, and there wasn't much trade with them, and Britain was trading with its own empire. So that in order to see these effects, you have to have the trade, and we have vast amounts of trade. I mean, the word is that the distance has gone to zero. Now, if growth falls, will we get out of poverty? Well, we could get out of poverty by redistributing it. You look at my graph, the number of people in incomes above 50,000 a year in dollar terms in the world is staggering. The number of people who are living in $1.45 is 1 billion. It wouldn't take much to shift them out of that if we could be willed to do it with scattering pound dollar notes over the countries to the people who've got it. Productivity, there's a measurement problem. It's a serious measurement problem, and the ONS is well aware of that. Martin showed you some of the things. Capital per employee has fallen quite significantly over the period, and that's quite important. And the type of jobs have changed. And I want to add to Paul's kind of stories that at one point, top American economist was heard to say that you see computers absolutely everywhere except in the productivity figures. Bob Solo. And then eventually they suddenly appear. Learning takes a long time, and our students know that. They spend 3 years getting their undergraduate, 2 years getting a master's, and then we tell them they know almost nothing and look at the world.
Okay, Martin, reasons to be optimistic or reasons to be cheerful? Or?
Well, we've already done those. And no, we're all I'm a passionate long-run optimist. I mean, it's absolutely crazy for some. I started, my life as an economist, very different one, in the World Bank. And when I look back on where developing countries were in 1970 and where they are now and the impact that's had, I mean, it's a completely different world. So the change, though far from optimal, one could imagine better, has been staggering. And David's mentioned so many other trends, health. People are moaning about aging. I have to tell you, from my point of view, aging's great. Though I do understand that my children and grandchildren would wish we'd all leave the stage. So I'm a real long-term optimist. I wish I were also optimistic about the quality of policy making in advanced societies at the moment. Now, Vijay's asked two very interesting questions, and one is simpler than the other. I think it's perfectly clear to me that China, India, and the rest of Asia, for reasons David has already indicated, could grow very successfully with the right policies. I don't have the time to discuss this, even if the developed country continues to stagnate. Another monstrous crisis might be another matter, and Paul and David have also both indicated the possibility, but I think they could, and they're quite big enough to generate largely domestically driven growth. And this then raises the question of why is there this quite general slowdown in emerging economies? So here are my hypotheses. One, after the crisis, China kept the whole world growing. China's kept the commodity boom going, which was immensely important to a hell of a lot of emerging countries. And China's now slowing down, and it's partly slowing down because the policies it pursued after the crisis were not really desirable and sustainable to keep its growth going for a whole host of reasons, and partly because, in my view, it got very, very serious structural imbalances in the 2000s, which it has to sort out. And that has a huge global effect because it became another pole of growth. That makes the export-led growth type of model more difficult, and there's a lot of adjustment that has to occur to that. In addition to that, I would add financial markets are continuing to misbehave, quite problematic for quite a number of countries. And I think a lot of countries stopped doing quite sensible reforms in a whole number of different ways because things were so great during these successive credit booms. So a whole host of factors that have come together to force, I think, another round of reform and policy making. Finally, I don't have much to add on productivity. I think this is, I think the mismeasurement thing is probably quite important. And I'd just like to make, the pretty obvious point that working out the productivity of somebody in managerial, in consultancy, and things like that is just really, really hard. And it's not very difficult for me to imagine that we're getting these measures wrong, though that certainly doesn't explain why they've suddenly changed since 2007. So, because I don't assume that they're not getting it suddenly wronger.
Paul, last words.
Okay. Just quickly, yes. Even more striking, I think, in the 30s was that Latin America had a quite good decade. So so that can have an interesting question, why not? And I think that would take us too long of speculating. I think a lot of it is a China story. And I think people may have simply been too optimistic about what China's prospects were, that China, in fact, has run out of peasants to move into the modern economy, and that we should have seen that coming but didn't. But I don't know that for sure. Just a word on inequality. I think that there's two things. It is important to talk about inequality at the bottom as well as at the top. And I'm struck, coming from the United States, at how relatively, but you have no idea. I mean, when David talks about, well, we need to move back the pension age because of rising life expectancy. In the United States, the bottom half of the income distribution is not seeing rising life expectancy. And in fact, there's a peculiar thing now where working class white women are seeing sharply falling life expectancy. So the inequality is actually become an inequality of life and death in the United States. So it's very big stuff. And just to throw that out. On the productivity, if the productivity were really, really mismeasured, you would expect to see that there was a big dissonance between what we know about real earnings and what we see in the productivity numbers. We don't. Real earnings are down in Britain as well, which is suggesting, and those are numbers that are constructed in quite different ways. So the cross-check suggests that something is happening, and I don't know what the answer is. I think the bottom line, in some ways, I think the reason that Martin and I are probably more upset, perhaps, than normal human beings would be, is the intellectual, the horrible quality of the debate. I mean, the fact of the matter is that what we've been going through in the advanced countries these past 7 years is something we know a lot about. And in fact, although David's strictures against economics are all very true, the fact that short to medium run monetary and fiscal policy, God damn it, the models have worked pretty well. I mean, I like to say sometimes that until this crisis, I was never quite sure that I wasn't a phony. Because you write your papers, you get them published, but rarely do you get a chance to make predictions that are very much at odds with what people who haven't studied the stuff say, and see whether they're true, and to say, that we can have the Federal Reserve increase its balance sheet 400%, but under current conditions that won't cause inflation. Or we can have these big deficits and it won't cause interest, or austerity policies will in fact cause major economic contraction. And by God, it all came true. So we actually had the intellectual tools to do much, much better than we did. and no one listens. And you feel like you're a voice shouting and no one hears, which is really weird when you're writing on the opinion pages of the two of the world's most influential newspapers, but no one hears anyway.
Okay, communications challenges for the next generation of economists. Now there's a reception outside in the foyer to which you're all welcome. But let me, of course, thank once again the Sanjay Lal Memorial Trust for organising these events and the panel for a fabulous discussion and presentations. Thank you.